Podcasters Roundtable, Round 32, Podcasting Best Practices. Today, I feel like we've covered a lot of what we'll cover today, and what's interesting is that I think based on all the information or the feedback that I've gotten leading up to this round, if you don't know, I always post these as an event on Google+. Make sure to circle myself, Dave, or Daniel to get notified. Definitely circle myself because you'll get, we should get a direct link, and then hopefully Dave and Daniel share it as co-hosts. We hope they push it out there, but they do a good job. And funny because I'm seeing two Daves, which just tripped me out. Is it extra co-host? No, it's just two Dave. Dave in stereo, which is interesting. And don't worry, Dave. I only hear one Dave. We can see two Daves, hear one Dave. It's okay. Don't freak out. I see the eyes going all over the place. Live production. It is so much fun. So anyways, circle one of us or go over to podcastersroundtable.com and sign up for the email list so that you get not only notified when an event or when a roundtable is coming up, but that you also get to give some feedback because I post a question and people give feedback about it. And on this particular round, talking about podcasting best practices, I basically took everyone's feedback up to this point, pasted it into a Google Doc, and I'll probably just make that available so that everyone can sort of, scroll down the list and see what other people think are their top podcasting best practices. But when I came up with the topic, this is partially based on an episode that Dave did on his show, School of Podcasting. He talked about the rules of podcasting, and there are no real rules in podcasting. There are more. It's more like best practices, right? So I was curious what everyone thought those best practices were, because we all, most of us here, create a podcast, and as podcast creators, we know that really it's entirely up to us where it's posted, how it sounds, how you do your introduction, you name it. It's all up to you, and that is one of the awesome parts of podcasting. But it's also can be one of the things that brings us this large continuum of quality across podcasts. So if you listen to Dave, Daniel, or I on any one of our respective podcast about podcasting, or there's several out there who are also doing podcasts about podcasting, you'll often hear people talk about best practices, things they recommend you do that I think the majority of what we would consider a quality podcast, we did a round on what that actually means. Go check that out. And, people always suggest, hey, maybe do X, Y, and Z if you want to achieve, this certain result. And so whether that's monetizing or growing your audience or whatever your goals are for your podcast, there tends to be some general best practices. I was going to call them rules. General best practices we can follow. And so I've gotten a lot of feedback, and I was thinking that it would be more of a technical thing, right? Your ID3 tags, maybe audio production. But all the feedback I'm getting is it's kind of like, it's not ethics. I won't call it ethics. It's somewhere between ethics, and it's sort of the, make sure that you involve your audience, right? And all these things. What would you call that? Dave, what would you call something it's not an ethic, it's not necessarily a best standard, but these practices, you probably listed a bunch. I have Dave has a list here. And let's see, make content for your audience. I guess it's a best practice, but I was thinking technical. And I'm getting a lot of stuff that is not necessarily technical so much as it is, come on guys, what am I thinking of? What would you call that? It's not technical, it's not an ethic. Principles of podcasting, right? We love P's here in podcast. But that is the voice of Daniel J. Lewis. Let's get to the roundtable introductions, and then we will dive into deeper what exactly best practices means. Starting off on my left, it's funny because it's whoever accepts the invite first and gets in. It's like a scramble for positioning, right? So it's always interesting to see where people are. I can't put my co-host in a certain spot. So, anyways, that is the small laughter of Mr. Charles McFall. Welcome to. We have another one of those situations where it's not technically your first roundtable. You were there at the live roundtable at New Media Expo in 2014. It was so early in 2014. Yeah. I barely remember it. Welcome to the roundtable.
Thank you. I don't know if I was actually on the show, if I really just crashed through the crowd and waved my arms wildly, fell down drunk, and walked off, something like that.
You were kind of upset. We had a little bit of an audience.
You took my crowd. That's what it was, yeah.
We still want some thunder. That's the job, right?
It is. It is. Well, there's two ways to look at media, and I felt at that New Media Expo, both ways were being handled, right? There was we're the big boys, you pay to play way to look at it, and then there was our way to look at it, which was there's enough to go around. So, you had people, we had people. It was a fun thing, and it was easy to share, and that's why I love the podcast pavilion there. It was really nice.
Yeah, a lot of live podcasting on the show floor going on at the same time. At least two shows going on at the same time.
At least, yeah.
That was pretty cool. So, yeah, New Media Expo, something you haven't experienced before. It's worth checking out. And we've got Podcast Movement coming up. Charles, are you going to be at Podcast Movement?
I am not going to get to make it this year. Lots of things have changed, and the money didn't come up. But I talked to Gary back when he first was really pushing it out, and I'm very excited to see what he's going to do with that. Gary Leland, and I know there's three or four others involved.
Wait. You're not rich? You have a podcast.
I've had a podcast for a long time.
Dave wrote a whole book about how to get rich with podcasts.
I did.
Did you read it?
No. I was waiting for it to come out on tape. He's a podcaster, yet he does not read his book on Audacity. Or Audible, rather. I'm sorry, Audible.
Dave, you got to read your own book. You haven't even thought about that, man.
I have thought about it, and then I looked at it and went, man, this thing needs updated. So step 1 is updated. Step 2 will be read it.
Awesome. That is Dave Jackson, of course. Dave, welcome back to the Roundtable.
Yes, Dave Jackson from the schoolofpodcasting.com. Glad to be here, and this should be an interesting discussion.
I hope so. I hope you've done your homework, Dave. You had assignments.
I think so.
We could have had 4 days to figure this all out, but Dave pushed us to today, so No, I'm just kidding. Give him a hard time. Daniel J. Lewis, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back, and you guys did a good job on the last roundtable, even though I wasn't there.
Thank you very much. Approval is needed. Feels good. It's like getting an iTunes review. Hey, your show was good. Thanks.
What's an iTunes review? I don't think I get that.
It's one of those things you can track with a website like mypodcastreviews.com.
Look at that. Stepped right into it. And Daniel did not miss a beat. Mr. Promo Machine did not miss a beat. Good job. Yeah, that was not set up, although I expect my affiliate commission.
I think that's I want to say that real quick. I think that's a great best practice that most people miss in podcasting is you have to promote yourself, but not in a way that you're a jerk. And Daniel's very, very good at that, at promoting everything he does, and he's never a jerk.
Whew. I was getting nervous there on where that was going.
That's one man's opinion. That's one man's opinion. We'll poll the audience. We'll see. Chat room is with us. The chat room always rocks. If you think Daniel's a jerk, plus one. Plus one for Daniel's a jerk. We do have one more roundtabler. Looks like I may have sent the link to an opposing email, so he's going to be here in a second. That's John will be joining us. I hope. Hopefully he's still around, and we will introduce him when we get here. But let's dive into this since, Charles, you are the newest on the roundtable. Put your feet to the fire first, I guess.
All right.
When I said, can you help us talk about podcasting best practices, what was the top 2 things that came to your mind? Or what did you even think I was talking about?
Well, I know. It's the same thing I talk about with clients all the time. And I think Dave and I have had long discussions into the night talking about how other people don't do it, right? That's how we do. But the first thing that pops in my mind is why? Why are you doing what you do? Mm-hmm. And I can't speak for anybody else here, but I know you guys have been around forever. I've known all of you in different circles for as long as I can remember. And I started podcasting back in 2004. And I had no idea why I was doing it, and I lost my way, and I quit podcasting. But ultimately, when I got back into it, I had a goal of what I wanted to do and what I wanted to do with my show. So while the shows I've done have changed over the years, and the methods have changed over the years, I ultimately am still getting to where I want to be. So you need to know why you're podcasting. Is it to make people laugh? Is it to educate or entertain? Once Upon a Podcast honestly blew me away because it was just perfect timing, and you had a passion for the show. And I now have a show similar to that. I found a passion that I like, and I built a show around the game, and it's a niche market, blah, blah, blah. But when we hear somebody like Dave, who I love, on School of Podcasting, talk about you have to find your niche, I think I would phrase it as you have to know your why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Because if I just wanted to hit numbers, I'd have been out of this game a long time ago because I'm just now getting to where I feel like I'm getting a decent market in what I do.
So why do you think that's a best practice, right? I mean,
because it's easy to get into the shiny. I want to be a DJ. I want to be a rock star. I want to talk on the radio. And you fire up the mic, and here's your first podcast. Is this all? So, hey, this is the I'm going to talk to you podcast. There's no music, there's no nothing. Whereas that's fine when we started out in 2004, right? Because nobody knew what they were doing. But now there's a lot of ways out there that it's a smart market. People know what podcasts are now, and they expect more of the, sizzle, the production level that they get in standard radio.
Yeah, so one of the first people who commented on the feedback when I posted this on the, I believe this comes from the event page, hopefully where most of you are watching and chatting right now. The chat room looks like it's starting up there. And in fact, Gary Fawcett in the chat room says, don't podcast when the room is full of bees. He does a beekeeping podcast. So if you are a beekeeper and you do a podcast, that's a good best practice. But Jose Gomez, he says, he writes, show outline, research, and prep time. It kind of goes to what you're saying, but it's about thinking about your show ahead of time, right?
Well, okay, for me, the why is what keeps you going when there are no numbers. I'm that guy who I've done show prep, and I'm not the person who writes out the script or even has an outline. I do best, like tonight, where I walk in and just throw me a question, I'm going. That's my style. But without some kind of prep of thinking about what we're going to talk about, or even building your own podcast, knowing who's your market, who you want to talk to, it becomes work. And if you don't know why you're doing this, even the people who do want to do what you're talking about, doing all the show prep, doing the study, writing the notes, typing them up, making sure you have great intros and outros, paying for somebody to produce your show. When it becomes blood, sweat, tears, and money, it becomes work. And if you don't know why you're doing this, you're going to quit, and you're not going to be happy. And for me, I think it's all about being happy.
Cool. And hold on one sec, Dave. Let me bring in John, who we saw pop in here. I have to unmute him. That's the way the Hangouts work here. And I believe he's unmuted. John, welcome to Podcasters Roundtable.
Thanks, Ray. How you doing?
I am doing fantastic. And real quick, where are you coming from? Where are you sitting there? Where's your studio located?
So I'm in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm in my apartment. I have a loft area that I've turned into a studio/office. So you
Gotcha.
can see my beautiful washer dryer doors behind me as well.
Well, me too. I'm in an office in Arlington. I'm back in my old stomping grounds. But I will say that it doesn't quite sound like the SM57 is coming in. I don't know about you guys, but just FYI. But all right, so John, thanks for joining us, and now you know that we can actually hear you. And Dave, go ahead.
Well, he was talking about prep. I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I was moving my office, and I was trying to struggle to do an episode. And I knew what I wanted to talk. I had my notes in my head, so I did as I riffed off the top. I had my little mental bullet points in my head. And instead of writing them down and thinking about it, and I even said, I'm doing this without notes, so do as don't do as I'm doing, or however that goes. And it was when I later typed the show notes that I came up with the idea of a good podcast typically has the same ingredients, but what recipe you come up with that is up to you. And I was like, oh man, that's a great point. I wish I had done this in reverse. I wish I had typed this, because that would have come to me, and that was great. I almost went back and re-recorded that episode just to make that point. Instead, I did it in the following week. But that's just an example of just a little time to calm down and go, okay, what do we want to get out of this? What am I trying to say? That I was like, oh man, and that's what I said, no more. I'm never doing a show without notes, because I had that one shot to really just hammer it home, and I was like, you blew it. So,
but see you have to find. I like what you said about recipe, because every chef cooks differently, right? Mm-hmm. You have to find what works for you. Because I had Dave on Success Freaks not that long ago, and we were talking about something, and my entire show notes to start with was Dave Jackson. That was it. But that was the style of the show. I could just talk and interview, and it's somebody I trust, and I know he can handle his own. And I know there's no question, knowing him, that I couldn't throw at him. So you have to find your own way, because if I try to do it the Dave Jackson way, and I'm just starting out, I might find something that builds a good machine, but ultimately I can't make it work, because that's not my style of cooking.
Yeah, and when you're working on a podcast, All right, a best practice with podcasting and planning and outlining and all of that stuff is, what is it that will appeal to your audience the best and communicate the best to them? I think we need to think a lot about our audience. Now, the cool thing is with podcasting is that we can build our own audience. We can have the audacity to podcast and it be anything. By the way, I have a show about that. It can be anything that we want it to be, and we don't have to care about the audience. But I think it is a best practice to care about the audience, to think, what is the audience interested in hearing? But it's not like we have to make that drive us to decide, well, I'm only going to podcast what the audience wants to hear, and I'm never going to talk about what I think the audience wants to hear. It's kind of going back to that thing with how Ford said that if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, and Steve Jobs said something about phones and stuff like that. That kind of thing where sometimes we have to be in that place of deciding, I think this is what my audience needs, or I want my audience to hear this.
Without feedback, let me throw this out to you guys. Without feedback, because especially when you start off, you don't get feedback for a while.
Yeah.
How do you know how you're reaching the audience?
I think that's where it involves knowing what you want your show to be about and making it about that when you first start. So you're not drifting when you first start, but then as you start to receive feedback, that's where you can maybe start reshaping the show, or at least knowing what some of your audience is thinking out there and keeping that in mind as you shape the show in whatever way that you want to.
Yeah, and as you, Charles, as you alluded to, the fact that you come up with, the why and what's going to drive you through the episodes when maybe people aren't listening, or you've got something you want to talk about, and it better be something you actually want to talk about, right? So you've got an idea, you've got plenty to say, so start saying it, right? And then while you're saying it, ask for feedback, right? And you'll get there, it'll come. And then, I always tell people to grow as they go, right? So you make that adjustment. It's like we're going to talk a little bit about audio production, like the quality of your audio, and it's kind of like set your gain knob and dial back a little bit, right? I mean, just to dial in where your microphone is. So you've got an idea of where to start, and then I think you can fine tune it. I think we're always working on our podcast as long as we have a podcast, right? So hopefully you're continually tweaking, and you might follow, you're going to listen to maybe one of us talk about how to start a podcast, because when we start, nobody knows. Most people are not trained in audio and video production or marketing or anything. We are the every team, right? We're the marketing department, you name it, we're the department that gets it done. And so you have to know a little bit about everything. So you go out, you get some advice, find out what those best practices are, or if you're there in the early days, you muddle through it and you make mistakes, and you find out that using your sample rate at like 48 kilohertz or whatever is going to sound like a chipmunk in like this old flash player, right? So someone toss out a technical best practice, and I don't know if John, if you have one of those on the top of your head, if you can think of one thing that is not. We're sort of talking about the Daniel. What did you say they were? The principles. The principles of producing a good podcast. That in general, a successful podcast will follow. And that is, here we've talked about having something that you want to talk about, maybe integrating your audience, getting feedback and tweaking that, these sort of bigger ideas. But if you want to start a podcast, what's one of the first things you need to do to turn the dial to get it going technically? Anyone have, John, do you have one on the top of your head?
The first thing to do technically?
Sure, a technical best practice, as opposed to like speak to your audience. Be kind. Don't swear if it's not explicit. Those are great, but
I would just say to practice a lot. Like you said, you really don't know going into it what different settings when you record sound like. So it's really worth just doing practice, test out the different settings, go through all those different things, see what people are out there saying. Because I know for myself, we've gone through like 15 or 20 different iterations of what we record at. And it's only from trial and error that we've found those, and from reading what you guys put out there and all that kind of good stuff.
So Daniel, along the lines, and that's good, test, right? I mean, the best practice is to definitely test before you launch if possible. You definitely want to do that. Charles, you may have alluded to that, right? When your first episode is, that's content, but if the people can't hear your first episode, you're going to have an issue as well. But Daniel, I want to start a podcast, and I want to make sure I get in iTunes, and I want to make sure I get new Noteworthy, because we know that's all the rage, right? That's what Dave tells us every episode. No, I'm kidding, Dave. But we want to do these things, right? So what are we looking at spec-wise? I'm trying to push everyone towards the tech here.
I think one of the first technical considerations that people shouldn't just jump on, assuming one way or the other, is would you do audio or video? A lot of people see video as really the flashy thing to do, because if you do video, you can be on YouTube in an actual video way. And a lot of people are excited about video, and you can do really cool things with video. But a lot of podcasts are audio, and so many apps out there, podcast apps, are audio only. So it's something that you really have to think about, what fits your content that you plan to produce, because you have no audience at that point. So does your content work better in an audio format, or does it work better in a video format? Because that first decision really affects so much else. That affects your budget for a big thing. It affects how much time you have to spend producing your episodes, preparing your episodes. It can affect so much down the line in technical decisions.
Right. Okay. Audio show. I want to start an audio show. What's the first thing I need to do to make sure that happens? Without a topic. Content, I figured I know what I want to talk about. That's why I want to start an audio show. Dave, what do I need to grab? Should we have a brief discussion about microphones? There's a best practice, right? Certainly there's a best practice when it comes to microphones.
I see now Dave and I disagree on this point. This could be
good.
Okay, good. Bring it on, man.
I know Charles loves to use his onboard microphone, but because what more is to disagree other than the finer points of a PR40 versus an RE?
Holy crap!
Well,
this is not a podcast for the 1%ers out there. Okay, we got a budget to work on.
Well, I just
look what I'm holding. Anyone? This is at the time I bought this, it's a $35 microphone. So
see, there you go.
I'm the 65th percenter.
Yeah, I just unsubscribed from a podcast because their audio was all over the place.
Yeah, you talked about in the pre-show, right? So that's relevant here.
And it was
it drove you away.
Yeah, when I had to reach for the volume knob for the third time, I'm like, and we're done with you. And then what gets me is I went to 2 other episodes. I'm like, all right, maybe he had a bad day. And next one was like, all right, he's podcasting from the shower again, apparently, or a mammoth cave or something. And I just went, all right, we're done. So, because it was shocking. I won't name the person or woman or man or transvestite, whatever it was. I'm trying to keep anonymity here, but it was a daily show interviewing entrepreneurs. So I'm not sure if I can find another one of those or not.
You did, yeah. At this point, you haven't narrowed it down very far.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're good. We've got a lot of those shows. It's the rage, so whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the rage in podcasting so much as it's the rage in our circle, right? But we won't get into that. Like, I think we see these blips, right? So tech podcasts were huge in the beginning, and then I'm trying to think what's the next waves. Comedy blew up, and that really was a wave in podcasting. Now we're seeing sort of a lot of entrepreneurs, and they're just I think they were bloggers and they discovered how amazing podcasting is, right? So they're entrepreneurs. They're going to figure out how to way to monetize it, right? And they're coming in, and hopefully we can take a little bit of what they're doing over to podcasting. So it's always interesting to see these little blips on the radar of content blips we see. But so Dave, if I'm going to start an audio podcast and I need a microphone, I'm just going to flip on my computer and look like Charles. I'm going to use my onboard mic, right?
No. Now here again, I don't want to say you should, because I don't want to shoot on anybody.
Oh, you should. I think this is a should show.
Yeah.
And say that really fast, you might get in trouble.
Yeah, I would say, spend the whatever, go to the Q2U. What's that thing's going for these days? $40
Q2U if you're in Europe.
Yeah, if you can't do the ATR 2100, do that. But I would not go with the built-in, laptop microphone because there are so many podcasts out there that aren't doing that it used to be in 2005 you could do that because everybody sounded like crap.
Yeah, but you're not starting off at the top. I mean, here's the thing. This is the one thing I was like, Dave, you're killing me. Back in the day when I
It's a
listened.
$35 microphone. It's not the top.
Now,
That's
but
new.
no.
That's a recent development. This microphone
Right.
was not available. It used to be the $99 Shure SM58, right? That was a standard best practice in podcasting.
Blue makes good microphones, and they have a nice little USB compact.
This is debatable. This is very debatable.
Anyway,
It's Charles' best practice.
As long as you're in a studio, absolutely.
Yeah, as long as you're in a quiet place, go for it.
look,
Blew your brains out. Go for it.
I like my eyeball. It works very well. But here's the thing. I don't use that now. That's not what I'm on now. But with Dave, when I first started listening to school podcasting, I think Dave's package. Now, granted, you're right, Ray. Back in the day, I mean, 99 was one of the starting levels, and his package was like $150 to get started. Not that he was selling it, but this was his best practice. I'm like, Dave, I got started on $35, man, because I found deals on Woot, and my wife knows how to find deals and stuff. But I'm going to tell you, because content is harder to develop than technique, and it's harder to develop than your microphone. If all you have is your onboard mic, by all means, use your Office Mac, to do it, because the stuff uses good built-in microphones. No, you don't want to stay there, but if you're going to start out with the best thing you can get your hands on. And right now, you can get some $35 mics.
And here's the thing.
I would start with my phone, man.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing when it comes to best practices. Okay, that's your choice. Okay, you've got. I want to start today. I have zero cash. I got to use what I have. Okay, fine. A best practice then would be to get close to the microphone, right?
Exactly.
So if you have any microphone, might be able to work. Actually, it's about half the time the environment you're recording in, and then your technique on the microphone. So, can you make an iPhone or an onboard mic work if you have to? Absolutely, right? Just need to know a few things about it.
I think my last stance on this is how much work are you going to put in? If you don't have money, you have to put in a lot of work. And something I learned from Mike Rowe.
Call that audacity. Okay.
I think there's a show about that. Maybe I'll start one. I don't know. But Mike Rowe was on Dirty Jobs, I think it was, but they did a nice little aside where he was doing voiceover work on the road, and he had the huge comforter up over his head, and he had some cheap little road mic and a Mac. And the whole comforter thing was he suffered through the heat and the uncomfortableness of it because he was doing the work to make it sound good. And if all you have is a built-in mic, you have to do the work to make it sound good. Get in a little closet in your house, put a blanket over your head, suffer. I'm in the middle of July in Georgia in a room over my garage, and I turned off my air conditioner and my fans to make it sound better for tonight.
The fan in the background, as you see, is not moving, and
Right.
it is over 100 degrees here in Northern California. So, yes, and I'm sitting in front of a window to get nice light, right? So all the sacrifice is happening right here, right? It's hot, it's sweaty. I don't wear earbuds over the ear for a reason. Cover up your ears is a great way to stay warm. So, Charles, you might want to get some earbuds. You'll cool down a little bit there, let your ears breathe. But yeah, definitely. So make the sacrifice, right? We bleed for our craft, Dave. We really do.
We do.
John, so when I started this in this Google Doc, which I'll share in the show notes at podcastersroundtable.com/32, those were my first things. I thought of things like sample rate, bit rate, CBR versus VBR, and in the chat room right now, all this is like glazing by like a really fast ticker thing on the ESPN. Don't worry about it. ID3 tags, subscribe buttons, iTunes tags.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because Dave is the one that really pounded into me, and he's right. ID3 tags will make or break you, right?
I don't need those anymore, right? That was a best practice from 2004, right? I'm leading, obviously. I think you do need them. John, do you put ID3 tags into your show?
Yeah, we do. And I wanted to bring up, you mentioned new and noteworthy and all that kind of stuff too. And doing artwork that's, to spec for iTunes, 1400 by 1400, making sure that if you do have text in it, that it's still legible at the smaller size within the store. I mean, I know that's what the people at the iTunes team actually look for when hand selecting those to put up there on new and noteworthy. So that's another thing, just to make sure that you have solid artwork, it's legible, catchy, and you just increase your chances of getting put on there.
Yeah, now that brings up a very interesting thing because it makes me think, whose best practices are we following, right? I mentioned these are not codified rules. They don't exist in podcasting. In fact, Daniel, can you give me one rule that a podcaster has to follow to have a podcast, besides obviously having a way to be able to record something that people can hear?
They must have an RSS feed with media files downloadable via the enclosure tag.
Okay, so we got our definition of podcasting. You do not have a podcast. You have a YouTube channel when your video is embedded on your sites, and I cannot subscribe via RSS, and then they get downloadable, all that stuff, right? We've defined podcasting. So we know we must have, if you want to have a podcast, there are a few rules, and it needs to meet those. And I think they're very interesting. I also, if you look back, those definitions are all over the place, and they tend to vary. And I like the part about serialized content in episodic format. Personally, I think a podcast needs to fit under the umbrella of something, whether it's we talk about everything, or we talk about business for the elderly, whatever you're talking about. Every episode sort of fits under your overarching topic, and then you kind of continue on a theme down the road. It doesn't have to be, but it is in the original definition, from what I remember, that this episodic content is serialized its format, right? So I don't know if that sparked anyone. I mentioned originally, though, no rules. Daniel gave us some rules to have a podcast, but so once we have a podcast, I got it. I meet the definition. Do I have to do anything else that anyone says, and who says, right? John's point about the iTunes, I think, is very important, because that's what we tend to follow, right? Because it's the 800-pound gorilla, or is the gorilla 300 pounds? I always forget, right? But that's
they change it every week.
This is a thing to challenge, and I just wrapped up this mini-series I was doing about challenging the podcasting assumptions, but is launching and trying to get featured in iTunes or whatever platform other than iTunes, if there is one, but is that really something that is a best practice? Because I've heard now two very prominent podcasters, well, several different prominent podcasters talk about different approaches. One will say, work very hard to get featured, and another will say, no, don't get featured. It's a better thing if you're not featured. Then you can build your podcast, make it grow in quality, and then you can get the attention. You don't want to lead with a bad product.
And this is important because I think, Daniel, you mentioned or talked about this maybe on one of your episodes recently, that new and noteworthy does not mean you can only be in there in the first 2 weeks or whatever the spec, right?
8
new,
weeks.
it doesn't. It's new and or noteworthy, right? Who talked about that? Was it Daniel or Dave? It was Daniel.
I talked about that. It's really a list of two separate lists, a list of new podcasts and a list of noteworthy podcasts combined into one and just called new and noteworthy. And the list is actually much bigger than you see. So any podcast that launches makes it into new and noteworthy. It's just somewhere near the bottom of the list, and it's not visible on the front page.
But the important point is so this whole, what you're talking about, maybe not being featured, right? If you don't work towards that in the beginning, it doesn't mean you can't be featured in new and noteworthy down the road.
Right. You have a higher chance of being featured when you first launch.
Right.
But the problem is that you get this huge amount of traffic often with a feature like that. And if you're not marketing something high quality, and if you don't have a lot of content out there, people will check you out, and then they will check out, and they won't be back later on.
Dave, hold on, Charles, sorry. Dave, I have an assignment for you. Do you have the Google Doc where I listed everybody's?
Yeah.
Can you go to that, pick something you like, and we will go back to that because I want to get more of the comments in here. Before I let Charles speak again, because I'm the ruler here apparently with the gavel. It is in my hands. Not a podcast award that I can wave, but it is my show, so back off. But that made me think, Daniel, I've also heard, you guys probably may have heard this, and I don't know if I've heard this in a long time, but at one time there was a strategy of only publish on iTunes. Don't distribute wide, because if you funnel everyone to iTunes, then you don't make your audience sort of spread out. You can basically get yourself higher in iTunes because everyone has to go there, subscribe there, comment there, rate there, right? So it just made me think of that. I don't think that that's necessarily a best practice. I never agreed with it, at all. You should distribute far and wide, right, Dave? So as a best practice, let's talk about that rule. Oh, I have Dave on assignment. Never mind. John's been podcasting for a long time, right? You got what's the name of your show? Your main show, John?
Smart People Podcast.
Smart. He's smart, and he's people, and he's podcasting. It's perfect, right? So he can feel this one. And when did that start? How long have you been podcasting? Let's ask that question.
We started in December 2010.
Yeah. Okay. So you got even now. That is 4 years under your belt, right? So a decent amount of time podcasting. What do you think about when it comes to distributing your podcast? What do you think about that as a best practice? What do you do? Do you only go to iTunes? Do you only go to iTunes and do you only get the top 3?
Yeah, I mean, so when we started in 2010, iTunes was really the only thing that we knew about. So we, I guess went through that first, and then now iTunes, Stitcher, there's a couple other platforms out there. But it really is like we put most of our focus into iTunes. It's what's worked best for us. Stitcher is starting to grow now, but the one-offs that are out there, we just haven't had too much luck with. So we've kind of stuck with iTunes.
What can we say? And now, Charles, I did interrupt you, and I'm actually going to come back to you up for this point and then let you go and make your own point, if you can even remember what that was at this point. Because of that, because of distributing and not getting much of an audience somewhere, should we just, what do we do with that? Do we submit everywhere? I guess is the question. What's the best practice on your idea for distribution?
Oh yeah, you got to. Well, first off, it needs to be on your website. Number one, you need to have one website to rule them all, so that everybody knows where to get it. It's easy to find.
What if I just use the website that the host, my host has a blog site for me? Or Dave, forget it. Best practice: use Blog Talk Radio. They'll give you a site to let you submit to iTunes. That's a joke for podcasting. That is not a best practice, right? So can I just use what is given to me? But what about even like a blogspot.com? The podcasterstudio.blogspot.com.
Okay, let's roll this one back all the way out to where we talked about before.
Really wants to make his point.
No. I got a different. That was a different point. But when you talk about, it keeps coming back to what do you have to work with. If you really want to start something and figure out if you need to get your toes wet, Blog Talk Radio is fine to start. We're going to tell you. I'm not going to put words in everybody here at the table's mouths, but I believe they feel the same way I do. Whereas if you're on Blog Talk Radio, you're not being taken seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point. Dave walked out.
Dave walked off. Dave walked off.
It's over. You said the magic words. I put my arms up. You know how when they find people in a murder scene and their arms are up and they got stab wounds all over? I was ready for
the opinions of Charles McFall did not reflect those of the other panelists.
Not necessarily those.
That's fine. No, that's fine. I've done a lot of interviews throughout AM radio, and I've learned that when you want me on your show for an interview, if I see you're on Blog Talk, I don't rule you out, but I definitely do a lot more research on your show because my experience, I'm going to qualify this, my experience with Blog Talk Radio was the audio was not up to my standards that I could do on my own. And secondly, most of the people who are there aren't serious about what they're doing. It's not because of the platform, it's just the people that I've experienced through there. They're not serious about what they're doing. And that's where I'm at. I think Dave would agree with this point. If you don't have a myshow.com somehow, some way, even if it goes back to Blogspot, if you don't own a name, you're having fun. I mean, I guess there are levels to podcasting, right? It's what do you want to do with it? You want to just have fun? I've got a friend of mine who's been podcasting for over 5 years now, and they have 25 listeners. And they don't care because he's just having fun. It's a huge hobby for him. He'll buy the .com, and that's about it. But then there's other people out there, like Dave and Daniel and yourself, Ray, who've built a business, per se, on helping people do podcasting or getting better at what you do. And like myself, I take it seriously, and I'm trying to make a career out of it, doing non-coaching, doing other things. You can go to Blogspot, but you have to have these things. So, yeah, you need to spread it out wide, as my circular answer comes back to your question.
If a guy came up to me and said, I'm a wealth coach, and I can help you, we're just going to build your wealth, your bank account's going to go crazy. He hands me his business card, and I turn it over and it says printed for free by Vistaprint.
Vistaprint. Exactly.
Why do you think he's rich, Dave? He doesn't spend money on business cards. He takes advantage of free option and uses coupons.
Okay, well, there's a point to that.
Rich people are cheap for a reason, people. I get your point, though, David. I mean, certainly best practice website is always
point,
nice.
Though. There are people that just want to do it for fun, and I get that.
Yeah, that's fine.
You know, this show is a little difficult because we get lumped, and I will say we. I don't know what they're calling us these days, Dave.
The tripods is the last one I heard.
Tripods, right? Sure, right, whatever. We kind of get lumped as the one person, and like our advice comes from some magical same source from the book that only Dave, Daniel, and Ray are allowed to read and speak from. But I feel like we get lumped into consultants, and so our advice is sort of taken, I feel like, in one chunk necessarily. Whereas I actually don't do this. I don't make money podcasting through my show. I'm a podcast producer for another network. So it's very interesting, but it made me think of that when people have been talking about how you are or what your goals are for your podcast, right? So Dave, you're kind of alluding to the fact that we all have, are you trying to make money from your show? Charles, you mentioned this, or are you just having fun, right? So those actually determine how much do you think those affect your best practices, right? What are the things that are different between someone who wants to monetize? We talked about sort of, I guess the concept that I'm always talking about is making investment in your show, prepare to be successful, prepare for those people to show up in mass, right? That's oftentimes why we give a best practice of getting some paid hosting, right? So that you can handle the surge when it happens. But, if you're just doing it for fun and the surge happens, you're on archive.org, it's fine, right?
If you're just having fun, why not? I mean, that's when the audience comes to you. I mean, one of the things, and I like Daniel's answer, but when I asked, how do you know what your audience wants when you don't know, when they're not talking back to you? I read a book, I don't know if they've ever talked about it or not, but I read a book called Creating More Powerful Radio and Podcasts, because when podcasts became popular, they tagged it on and re-released a book by Valerie Geller. But the biggest thing I remember her talking about is really for radio hosts. But if you're not enjoying what you're talking about, nobody else is either. If you have a passion, it comes through. And if all you're doing is having fun, talking about what you love to talk about, let them find you where you are, because that's what you're building. It's like you're in a bar and somebody sat down next to you and you're sharing what you love with them. As opposed to if you're really wanting to build a better show, you have that and all these best practices.
I guess what's the danger of not following a best practice? And we'll frame it in terms of this one specific thing. You start off for fun. I think almost all of us do, because you don't stick around usually if you're not starting out for fun, because it's hard. We don't. I think probably all of us here didn't start off with best practices. I don't know that many podcasters do. You get X, Y, Z advice, and then you go and you make mistakes and you learn what those best practices are. And they're best practices for a reason, because you probably paid a time price, right, when you had to make up for not using a paid host, or you hosted on your own website. I've had two people recently, they're always talking about it, and I don't see examples of it as often. They got kicked off their shared hosting site. Why? Their show got popular, right? And people are out there saying, hey, my show's popular. I'm doing it on my shared hosting. You just haven't been caught yet, and that's fine. It's fine. If you want to do it, I don't care, right? But it's risky, right? It's not a best practice for a reason. What's the consequence of not following a best practice? You name it, I guess, the best practice you want to think about.
A lot of copying and pasting. I have somebody I just got off the phone with, 6,000 downloads a month. I've never heard a number before. He's getting 6,000 downloads a month. I don't know how many episodes that is. And he's switching over to Libsyn, and now he's got to copy and paste all of his Libsyn links into his WordPress site. And so what does that cost him? A lot of time, or in this case, money, because he's going to pay me to do it. But, he was just having fun. He had no idea it was going to take off. He's really blown away. And I'm like, yeah, welcome to podcasting. People actually listen to these things. Mm-hmm. So, he didn't follow best practices, and he's now going to take it much more seriously. Kind of like the person that buys the starter home. If you got the money for the big home, I can tell you from somebody who just moved, moving's not a lot of fun, whether it's house to house or host to host or website to website. If you can do it right the first time, again, even if you're just doing it for fun, there's a difference between buying, a $200 set of golf clubs or a $30 set of golf clubs or whatever.
I can think of that. I can frame that specifically in terms of a mixer, right? So oftentimes we want to start off. We need the cheapest possible. Maybe we get like a 2-channel mixer that doesn't have an aux out. Inevitably, if we stick with this, certain things happen. We want to bring on a new person inside the studio, or we want to do a mix minus or something. So we often say, hey, buy a little bit more mixer than you need, because what happens? You're like, I'll sell this on eBay. You don't sell it on eBay. You end up just paying for 2 mixers, right?
Yeah. Well, mixers are, mixers are a fish pond, right? You'll grow to your size. If you get a little board, that's all you'll ever do.
Nice,
or you'll get to the point where you have to duct tape it. Actually, I think this is way back in the day. Dave, were you ever on What I Believe?
Maybe. Probably.
I don't remember. It's like 8,
yeah, I think so.
9 years. Okay, so this is way back when there was no such thing as best practices. And I had a 16-channel soundboard, but I didn't know how to use it. And so I'm coming, and this is back in the day when Skype would actually let you individually control the volume of each person on one thing. It's this weird. I duct taped the crap out of it, is what I'm saying. I came like out of my computer into the board, back out of the board into the computer with a microphone. It was this crazy thing that ultimately worked because I didn't know what I was doing. There was no best practices. Now, I had a client buy me this huge 48-channel board with all these ins and outs because they wanted me to do this magic. And actually, Ray, I consulted with you on how to make that magic happen, and ultimately got 8 direct outs to make the multi-Skype, multi-track, blah, blah, blah. And I'm growing into it because I had an engineer friend of mine go, "You'll never need that. You have 2 microphones." Like, no, man. It's a fish pond. You will grow to what you have. So,
Daniel, you answered a question in the chat room from Des Walsh, who asked, which is better, a dedicated site for the podcast or a directory on your main website? Right, and that can be considered a best practice. What would be your advice there?
Yeah, my advice is make it fit. If it doesn't fit, then maybe you need a separate site. So if the podcast content is very similar or maybe even some of the same content as the website, then it's a great place to host them both on the same platform. If they're completely different, it's best to start a new platform for that other content.
Cool. Dave, did you pluck something from the page there?
I just picked one that was easy, and because I know you're kind of going for technical stuff. And we've talked about
I'm going for whatever. I mean, okay. Dave, it's open. So
well, this one's easy and it doesn't cost you a dime. And I think we've had an episode about this, but podcast titles. I just found. Does anybody know the name Ginger Lynn? She is a porn star from the 80s.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to say I know that name.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you how I found.
The fact that nobody went, yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a trick, Dave. That was trick.
And she's apparently been doing radio for 10 years. And if you look, I did a video. I'll throw the video in the chat room.
Where's this going? A video with a porn star?
I did. Well, she has a segment. I'm not making this up. She has a segment on her show called "What's in Ginger's Booty." I'm not making that up. And
I know a sponsor.
But her titles are just Gingerlyn July 1st, Gingerlyn July 2nd, and I'm like. Yeah. I was like, man, I'm not talking about putting the episode number. I'm talking about that's just a waste of, if this was Ginger interviews whoever, okay, and she's really relying on her name. So a best practice is use a title that makes people want to go, oh, I want to hear that. And Daniel, you're the king of titles, man. What book did you read? What book did you read that? Because Daniel has really great titles.
It's just somewhere along the line. Here's the thing. If you want to come up with great titles and great content, read stuff about content marketing, about making great sentences. There are so many blogs out there and articles on it. But the thing is, figure out what communicates well and also is kind of enticing. Like, just look at your Twitter stream and see, what kind of stuff makes me want to click on it? What kind of titles are interesting to me? And then you do some of the same kind of thing. That doesn't mean you have to do the whole link bait thing where it's like 5 amazing tips that will change your entire life, and you won't believe number 3. Don't do the whole BuzzFeed thing.
So I was gonna say Facebook. You spend a lot of time on Facebook. So, Daniel, this is important because this is best practice, and it comes to title. The catchy title versus is actually going to work for us to help us be found SEO, right? How do you balance? Because people start off and they want to do the clever title, the inside joke in their title, but that does nothing to tell you does nothing to tell the bots what the heck the episode's about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's best to try and go with something that is a little bit boring but communicates what you're about. You don't want to go completely cute. Like, I have a clean comedy podcast called The Ramen Noodle. That's how it originally launched as its name, and no one would ever search for The Ramen Noodle. They might search for clean comedy. So I changed the name to, it's now officially The Ramen Noodle Clean Comedy, and I also put in the word podcast in there for SEO. But that's the title in iTunes. And your whole show title, I think, is where you can get a little cute as long as you add some of the other keywords as part of the title. But to Dave's point, your episode titles are really important to be as straightforward as possible.
What he said. I had a client actually many years ago. They were just getting into podcasting, and I was trying to teach them. They didn't want to listen to me. They were doing their own research, and I'd never verified this. But at the time, Penn Jillette had just started podcasting, and I think this was his Sunday show that he was doing. And my client told me that the MP3 file that nobody sees but you, basically. I don't know how it works into bots or anything else, but the whatever .mp3, your actual MP3 file, was like Penn Jillette Sunday School, June 14th, 1998, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this huge, long, mile thing. I'm like, no, don't do that. Label it. Like my main show is Success Freak, so it's SF, or actually no, I've changed it. Here's a best practice I learned from radio. It was like SF133.mp3, that's what it was. Now it's Success-Freaks- a word from the title so that we know which show this is, and the number, because we like to number them. I know I've heard numbering's passe, but whatever. I guess I'm old enough to be old school now.
No, hey, so am I back? Question number one. Yeah. I lost that. So the audio only recording should be interesting as I'm telling them what happened. But I am back for the audio, for the podcast listeners. I'm back. Briefly, I like numbers too. I've heard, I don't know what the whole conversation was about, but I think as a best practice, numbers are still good. A lot of people say it really helps them, organize it in their own personal structure of their podcast, but it also sort of orients you. Sometimes it lets you know you're at the right number. I knew the last one was 32, and now all of a sudden they don't have numbers. I tried titles only in my show, Podcast Quick Tips. Was very, 3-minute show. How do you tell people easily where to go to get that show, right?
You come up with a keyword. That's what I'm trying to do more with the Audacity to Podcast. But like even in this series where this was one of the points I raised, is you don't have to use episode numbers. It might not always make sense, especially if you're telling people visit mypodcast.com/150. 150 means nothing to them. It might be better to give them a keyword. But even in my own series, I'm having to use episode titles episode numbers because I am mixing content in an episode, so I have multiple topics in a single episode, so I can't have just a single keyword for it. But when I get back to, now that I've finished this little mini series, I can get back to single topic episodes and do that / whatever simple keyword that works.
Yeah, I mean, it has to go to, for me, it has to go to the KISS concept, right? Keep it simple, stupid, right? Because people it's very easy. Oh, 32, I got it. And when you forget the name of the show, or I remember 32, 31, it just orients. I think it makes it easier for the end user, but it's a good debate to have and over best practices. But where did we end up when I bailed on the? Hopefully this still goes to the archive.
I was talking about the MP3 file and how somebody was naming it this huge mile-long thing of the name of both hosts, with guest, with title, with number. I was like, you don't need tons of space there. But John, I guess it's his name. Yeah, John hasn't got to say a whole lot, so I want to hear what he thought.
Yeah, John. So I should establish at the beginning of every roundtable, it is your duty to jump in and fight with the rest of the roundtable. But I try to toss to you as often as possible. It has gotten nighttime there in the East Coast, I see, and I
have terrible LED lights shining.
No, it looks fine. Here's a best practice, right? So coming on the roundtable, I tell people, I try to tell them, use your best microphone and then just shine a little light on your face, right? As long as that light's not behind you and there's no, and you're backlit and we're just seeing a silhouette like it's To Catch a Predator or something, good, right? It's just not that show. So,
See, Dave was laughing because the timing would be perfect for his black cloth to fall off the window behind him.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
just haul them away. Now, Dave, I did want to call you out a little bit because when I asked you to pick something off there, I think you picked your own. It says Dave Jackson episode titles. You have to go back. You have to go back and get something from one of the audience people. And
I like this one. Give your website, the visitor, the option to listen to your podcast right then and there. Have a player on your webpage.
That's huge.
I just read an article on the Crazy Egg blog that said the average visitor lasts 6 seconds on a website, and if you can get them to play and it catches them right out of the gate, boom, they're going to stick around a little bit. So one of the things I'm going to do, I don't know if this is a best practice, but it makes logical sense, is I'm going to put subscribe buttons on my About page. So that if they read it and they go, oh, this looks pretty cool, but instead of getting them to go play, why not go, hey, why not subscribe instead and go that route? But to me, I'm amazed at how many people I have to click and click and, oh, here it is, play. And I'm like, I don't know, the average person would be like, whatever, I thought it was a podcast. I don't see it anywhere. They're looking for that big giant play button.
In relationship to that, like I always see people, they use like a PowerPress for WordPress, which just gives you options to add players. It also gives you an option where to add that player in the post, and I see it at the bottom all the time. And we talk about this concept that you hear about above the fold. People on the internet leave really quick, and when they show up and they don't immediately know where to go, this has to go with even navigation. They leave, so you may have lost your one chance to get that listener. If their subscribe button, your subscribe or your play button is right there, it's obvious, it's underneath your title, it's in the top 50% of your web page or wherever people are most likely to, depends on the size of their browser. But the point is, you want to make it obvious that you have a player and that it's like click play to listen now. And this applies to things like iTunes as well because, Daniel, when it comes to cover art may be the one shot you have, right, to grab a person. John, you mentioned cover art. Elaborate a little bit more on cover art. You mentioned small text versus large text. What do you think about when you're designing cover art do you design your own cover art? A lot of podcasters do.
Yeah, I did design the cover art. I mean, it's just the show name has to be legible. Obviously, at 1400 by 1400, you're going to be able to see everything on there. But on iTunes, it displays something I think like 100 by 100 or 150 by 150, and that text, just shrunk almost tenfold. So you need to make sure that that text is legible, that the artwork's still legible, that people can recognize what that is just using the thumbnail.
Yeah.
And what do you think about changing it for every episode, or do you have a logo, a same piece of art for every episode that you do?
So we keep the same logo for everyone. We actually experimented with that, with having the show logo stay, but then the episode logo would be different. So whatever displayed in, whether it's the podcasts app or whatever other app you're using. And we started using a similar logo with the actual guest name and the episode number on there, and it just became too time consuming, and we weren't getting any feedback saying, this is great, we were dying for this. So it was just something that I thought our listeners would want, and it turns out that I was completely wrong.
Now, Jonathan, it is possible that you might not have been putting it in the right place for most of your listeners to see. Because iTunes recently switched, within the last year, they switched from that it would read from your ID3 tags to now it reads from your RSS feed for that image.
Yeah, this was probably about a year and a half ago. So if the change happened after that, I'm not really sure, but that's just what we noticed for ours.
What about you, Ray?
On that one alone, on that specific topic, the changing
global warming.
Oh yeah, well, so here's what I think about global warming. No, as I take a sip out of my plastic water container. I'm sorry, I gotta get better than that. I do care about the environment, but with the cover art thing, I know I've heard one time that you can increase, or you kind of have, you can give yourself a little bit of new life if you have an old show by maybe changing the color of your cover art in iTunes, because at some point maybe people are surfing in iTunes and they sort of breeze over your cover art, or it's not catching their eye for some reason. So you might be able to put in the same cover art and gain a new percentage of subscribers because now your cover art sticks out, right? So I don't know if you guys, I think Todd from Blueberry talked about that. He listed it as a percentage of, you can pick up X amount of new people simply by changing up your artwork. So there's an interesting...
Yeah, he said 25%, but I have to question,
like
is that going from a horrible design to a good design, or is that going from a good design to a good design?
Yeah, is it Netflix going from red to white? You're reversing the colors.
Yeah. So I think that as far as best practices goes, John points out some of the most important things. Is it legible? Can I easily see it at that small 125 by 125 size or whatever thumbnail that people are seeing it on, whether it's Stitcher or iTunes or Miro, wherever they're searching for it. And, in addition to that, can they tell what your podcast is about just by looking at the cover art? That's tricky, right? Because if you named it, let's talk about naming your show a little bit. When you started off, you were clever and you called it the Anything Show. Turns out, you guys, well, the Anything Show, right? I mean, that's going to be hard to get a foothold in the anything niche. Yeah. But maybe you're not talking. Maybe it's actually three guys talking about sci-fi books, but they call it the Anything Show. Anyone want to talk about naming a podcast and then, in relation to being able to tell what it is from that one small opportunity that you might have to grab a listener?
Well, you did.
Go ahead, Charles.
Okay, sure. I will. Don't mind. The point that got interrupted a while back actually plays into this. Is I wanted to get your guys' opinions on not even launching to iTunes until you're 10 episodes in. And here's how it plays into the title. I actually did about 5 episodes of tests never to be released to the public. This is my 3rd launch of a podcast at this particular time. And I did 5 episodes with never going to be released, and they're all under trying out different names and this and that and the other. Finally, right before we went live with the first #1 episode, we got a name, and it was Bear Crawling. And everybody and their brother for the entire 5 years, well, actually, I didn't run for about 6 years. For 3 years, everybody's like, what is that? I don't understand. It was very hard to explain. But once I hit my stride, people stopped asking what the name was. They got the feel from what I was doing to what it meant. But it was a very difficult name. And the reason, I don't even have an answer. The idea is, should you do a number of episodes before you really lock in a name, unless you know your niche? Like my game show, the video game I do is called From the Helicarrier. It's about Marvel Avengers Alliance game on Facebook. Daniel does one called Once Upon a Podcast. Everybody and their brother can figure out what that podcast is about from the title. But sometimes you don't necessarily have that niche of a topic. How do you figure out your name to describe what you're doing when you don't really know what you're doing?
Figure out what you're doing before you name it.
You take your time, and because I had a comment from John Parker. This isn't in the chat room. He was commenting on my show that I did with Cliff. He said, if a host is talking off topic based on what one is led to believe a show is about from a show's title, that's where confusion happens. And he goes, but you also have to give leeway to the host. Is this a one-time thing, or does it happen in most episodes? And I think that's one of the things about naming your show. If you tune in because it's called, whatever, My Favorite Porridge Recipes, and you tune in and we're talking NASCAR, you're going to be like, what? So I think that is a key of naming it. And I'm a big fan of, I get real creative. If I do a podcast review show, I name it the Podcast Review Show.
And that's cool because you can tell. But here's the thing: a lot of us started in podcasting. Podcasting started as pretty grassroots. I won't call it a rebel movement, but ham radio. Dude, I don't want to be that stiff. All right, I want to name my show the Flippin' Larry Pickle Show, or whatever. It's cool, right? That's not a cool name, but someone will come up with a cool name, and there are so many successful podcasts that have a name like, and I wish I could come up with one.
Okay, I'll give you the crazy one. It actually did pretty well. This was my first one. I called it Pulling My Pod. And the acronym was PIMP. And it was very much, as soon as you heard it, you're like, that's just dirty. And it was just a morning Zoo Crew dirty show. And it did well because we had no point other than to drink in the early morning because I had nothing better to do in life at the time.
I know there's big shows in iTunes that you could not look at the title and necessarily know what it's about, right? So is it just a gamble, right? You don't follow the best practice of someone getting a title that they can easily tell, right? So the trade-off is that you get your cool title, but it might be harder to build.
Yeah, it's easier to build with a cool title if you already have an audience. Like, look at Michael Hyatt with his podcast, This Is Your Life. Well, what does that really mean, This Is Your Life? Well, he had a great audience already, so that when he launched the podcast, it was able to pick up a lot more. Same thing with like Ray Edwards. He has the, hey, guess what? Ray Edwards show.
Yeah.
And tells nothing about the title other than, the content, other than he's the host and it's his thing. But he had an audience beforehand. So I think when you do have an audience beforehand, you can get away with a little bit more than if you are starting from nothing.
Yeah, I think it's a very different segment of people coming to podcasts between the old media people or people who are coming, Nerdist or someone who comes from, who brings an audience. Even Leo Laporte, the guy we hold is, sort of one of the grandfathers of podcasting. He's in there mixing it up early on and has been maybe the most successful podcaster, but he brought an audience, right? So a lot of these early podcasters, they did have an audience somewhere else, or bloggers bring an audience even. So we've got these different class of people who maybe you're just a podcaster. I'm going to start a podcast, and no one follows you. Maybe you got 32 Twitter followers, and I'm one of them, and I'm not going to listen to your show. And I'm kidding. I will listen to your show.
But even Leo went obvious. This Week in Tech. You don't go, well, I wonder what that show's about.
Yep.
Well, have you listened lately? You do have to kind of.
No.
Sorry.
Guys, do you guys think that having a good description of the show, or even if you have like a 10 or 15 second blurb at the start of your show explaining what the show is, can help alleviate the fact that people might not know what it is just based off the title?
And Dave alludes to that, and when you talk about the title, sometimes I pick what to listen to based on the title. I'm like, I want to hear that content, which is tough because even for my own shows that I produce, I tend to talk about a lot of stuff that's not in the title. The main topic is in the title because when am I going to put 7 things in the title? Maybe I should narrow down my show to only talk about that thing. I can't do it. Guess what? It's my podcast. It doesn't matter. But I might pay a price for that. Someone may skip it and miss good content. So, I think there's something to be said for what Jon said about introducing maybe what you're talking about. Of course, I skip right over that stuff. When you spend 5 minutes telling me what your show is going to be about, I just want you to get to your content. So, what do you guys think about that? About the description? Now, hold on, Jon, are you talking about description that we see in iTunes, that we read about your show, or actually in the show itself?
So the first part when I brought up description was within iTunes. So when you do click on that title and you see the description there, and the same thing with like using proper keywords and all that kind of stuff. You can just all kinds of little things to do to make sure that people are going to the right place.
Yeah, I think for best practices, it's very easy question to answer as far as just your text description goes. It better tell me what it's about pretty quickly and have some good keywords in it that is not for just the robots. It's actually for a person, right? I want to be able to read within 3 sentences and know what your show is about because people are browsing in iTunes, wherever they're browsing now, and they move on, right? And so that might also be your one chance. And I don't know if there's a lot of disagreement that that's the place to have your fun.
Well, it's true, but you also have to mix, to me, to the lowest common denominator. When I first started podcasting...
Are you calling me stupid?
No, Jon might be, because he's claimed the title Smart People Podcast. No, but what I'm saying is I used to podcast for podcasters, so I didn't have to explain what an MP3 was. I didn't have to explain what a podcast was. You can come to my site, you had a play button and a download button, and that was it. And it was pretty crappy. But it worked, and podcasters listened to that back in the day. That's your audience, was other podcasters. But now, especially with most of my clients, I'm learning so much from them. I'm working with this entrepreneur group that was 100% CEOs. They don't really get new media. They don't get any of this, and this is why I get to work with them. And they're like, well, our audience is over 60. and they don't understand how to click 3 times to get to the podcast. So instead of me fighting and having to explain, well, it's this and this and this, I go, okay, let me mix for my world, that's the lowest common denominator. I don't normally get people who don't understand how to do this, but you find out when you do it that way, when you craft titles that are just, duh, this is what it is. But it's cool. It's in your own flavor. It's in your own voice, your own style. And you make your website so easy that when I want to find a podcast, boom, there's a post, there's a player on your front page. Or at least a tab that says, literally on this one website I do, this is what they wanted, and it works. Click here for previous episodes. That's the title of the link. Big, bold, right in the middle of the page. And it works. And when you do something like that, you're not going to miss your audience.
Yeah. So, Dave, let's address the second part of that, which is what Jon is talking about as far as description, I think, of the episode in the episode. Right, Jon? Is that also what we're talking about?
Yeah, or a little blurb. I mean, for example, for our podcast, we're an interview-based podcast, and we talk to authors, CEOs, that kind of thing. But in our intro music, we incorporated saying, you know, this is a podcast where we talk to smart people and don't claim to be the smart, like we don't claim to be the smart people. So that's within the actual intro music. So within 10 seconds, you're hearing that.
Yeah, Dave, I think there's a lot to be said for introductions and bumpers and, you know.
Yeah, anything that you can, the longer your audience is thinking, well, what is this show about, is they're that much closer to going, yeah, okay, next.
The show or the episode, they're definitely different things, right? Because here's the thing, we often talk, I don't like having to talk to the listener who is the first-time listener every time. Now, that sounds a little mean, but I think you know what I mean. Constantly saying the same thing to sort of orient the person who just found the show. As a kind of a geek and DIY guy myself, I kind of feel obligated to know a little bit going in. That doesn't apply. That's not a best practice. Best practice probably says you should orient the brand new listener every time. I'm not huge into doing that. So, you know, what's the difference there between the episode description and the show description?
I think if you can do that quickly, if you can come up with your quick little elevator pitch, I don't mind hearing it's the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, you know, live from New York or whatever they say, because it's, you know, it's the same thing you hear, and it kind of gives you that little comfort level. So I don't think that would, and that's just my personal opinion, but I think you have to give them an idea of what's coming up. And the thing that I need to focus on when we're talking about this is a lot of times I list a feature and not a benefit. Like if I say step-by-step tutorials, that's a feature of my website. What's the benefit? I'm going to save you time because you don't have to Google it 5,000 times. So I think we need to focus on here's what you're going to get out of this podcast, and we should know that answer before we hit record.
Yeah, and I have the tagline like produce, promote, profit from your podcast, but then it goes into the how much information about how to get a hold of you, how to subscribe. Do I need to teach you how to subscribe to my podcast in the first 3 minutes, right? So, Daniel, what do you think about all the extraneous stuff you put before you get to the content?
Yeah, it's jump into your content as quickly as possible. I think a best practice is hook your audience with your most interesting stuff first. That's the way newspapers have done it for years,
and I don't
hundreds of years.
I don't know if we've all given that advice the whole time we've been giving podcasting advice, right? That's why this one's good.
Yeah, and
that's a good one.
You'll hook people with your content, and they'll stay for the personality.
Yeah.
You want them to start trusting you because of the information you give, and then they'll be interested in your personal life. If you start out saying, hey, we're going to give you 10 tips for how to be the most awesome person in the world, but before we do that, I want to talk about my dog. It doesn't work, and people are going to be turned off and turn away. So as quickly as you can get into that, and it's a hard thing, really, especially with interviews, because one of the first things, somehow, I think it's like a habit we need to overcome, that in an interview-style podcast, one of the first questions we tend to ask our guest is, tell me about yourself. And that's one of the things that either you should have told the audience already before you start the interview, give the guest your own introduction, or maybe save that for the end, the opportunity for people to now hear, okay, this guest had some great information. I want to know more about them. Where can I connect with them and all of that? And I've actually done something before where I recorded an episode guest show that way. And then I took that part from the beginning where I asked them to talk about what they do, and I moved that to the end of the episode, and it worked beautifully.
Well, that's the beauty of the podcast again. You get to tweak it and try and play, and all of a sudden you go, I didn't know if that was going to work or not, but it did. I did a similar thing. I did the one episode about maybe we should all get to the point. My next episode, by the time I played my feedback and the last 5 and 5, because of my podcast story, I didn't get to my meat and potatoes to about 22 minutes into the show, and I'm like, wait a minute. I need to move that. I'm not doing as I say. I was like, well, that's not right. I gotta
also, podcasting best practice, don't actually be eating meat and potatoes when you're podcasting.
Right.
I have a lot of people comment. We do podcasting pet peeves. We've done 2 of them here on the Roundtable, and people will talk about, chewing gum or eating food or drinking stuff. You see me drinking throughout this. I have an on-off switch on my microphone, so I'm working that off and on so that you don't hear me hopefully taking swigs of water, because water actually might be a podcasting best practice because it is good to stay hydrated. Otherwise, you get those lip smacks that people hate hearing the sound of your mouth, right? That's for you, Charles.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
We've got 2 competing best practices. We've got drink your water. That sound, Dave, could just stay in the archives for the rest of the show.
You can also get your audience used to what you do, and there's some things you can't get past. And I cannot get past the lip smacking, this and that, the other. But I've got my Batman goblet that I drink out of, and from day one, show one, I'm always drinking something. Nowadays, it's water or coffee or those kind of things, because you're right. That's good speaking practice, is you stay hydrated so that you don't start coughing and choking, and your voice doesn't dry out, and those kind of things. But again, you don't want to sound like you're hitting a bong, because the water bottle is letting the air come in while you're drinking from it. I've heard that on shows. I'm like, are you smoking while you're recording? Because that's what it sounds like. And they picked up from the water bottle. And you have to be careful, but you have to be you at the same time.
That is one of the things.
My CEO just walked in, so I'd like to submit her feedback, chew her carrot at the same time while being on the microphone.
Be you. That's just what we're talking about.
For the podcast listeners, my daughter's in my lap eating a carrot, so I will let the roundtable go back to what they were saying. But she's in charge. That's all I'm saying.
That's one of the that came up over and over in this document, is people saying be yourself, be yourself, be yourself, be yourself. That was in there over and over and over. And we did a podcast review show with somebody who it's all about energy, and he said it's not going to be political, and then 3 times he said, okay, well, I know this isn't a political show, but I'm going to do this, and that's just the way he is. And we said, look, quit saying it's not political, let it be political, let yourself come out, because it was something you had to say. So definitely be yourself is strewn throughout this document. Be yourself.
And I just wanted to add too, we're talking about like best practices in terms of being yourself, but also respecting people's time. I know for the fact that I do an interview-based podcast on a weekly basis, I'm constantly, talking to people that have very busy schedules, and just respecting their time, making sure that you get everything that you need within that time and don't go over without asking them. I think for new podcasters, that's paramount, because people won't want to be back on your show or ask you to be back on if you're just not respecting others' time.
That going along with that, be prepared. Especially if you do an interview show, know what you're going to ask. Don't be and on, because when you go on, I've been on both sides of it, and on either side, when you don't know what you're talking about, your guest never wants to come back, and his audience won't listen. And as a guest, you're sitting there going, is there a question? Because you just went on a 5-minute diatribe, and now, oh wait, no, there's 10 questions in there. Thank you. I'll pick one and answer it. So yeah, be prepared is the same as being respectful.
Awesome. Well, I tend to do that, by the way. If you noticed, I will ask 10 questions in one probably. I brought up so many topics during this roundtable that we could have gone on with forever, and we're definitely longer than normal. Now, see, podcast best practices, should your show be the same length every time? No. Yeah, maybe if you're appealing to the biggest audience and they expect to be out of their car when they get, you know what I mean? They expect an hour long, they do their commute, and then you're like, I got to sit in my car because I really want to finish because Dave's going to turn into Binky and the Wiz. But it's 35 minutes past what I'm supposed to be listening to it. I got to go. But, again, it's my show. I like to let it run. Here's the roundtable. It's all about free flow. So we are long, but we are going to go ahead and shut this down. Continue the conversation on the Googles, the Twitters, however else you like having. Get in touch with everybody. We're briefly going to run through and maybe list your top podcasting best practice or your favorite. It doesn't have to be your top because we might all just go to content or something. That's boring. But and let us know where we can find your content and we will say goodbye. So who wants to start? Since I kind of threw out the name your favorite podcasting best practice. Daniel's ready to take this out of here?
Yeah. I would suggest that think about what would you be proud of in a year, 2 years, maybe even 5 years. Whether it's content, your production quality, your presentation quality, try to make something that you won't look back and say, oh, that was perfect. But you will look back and be proud of the effort that you put in and the result that you got with where you were at that point in life. Think about that. Think about forward-looking back. And I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com.
What was the website? I didn't catch it.
I'll let someone else
it's got a lower
repeat.
third.
Yeah, I can only say it so many times, so I'll let someone else repeat their website address a couple times.
All right. Dave, maybe one podcasting best practice, and where can we find your content?
My content is over at schoolofpodcasting.com. See, I don't want to go content, but I'm going to go content. If you can solve somebody's problem, if you can do the work, find the solution, and deliver it, they will be your friend for life. Mm-hmm. And that's an easy place to start. It takes time to find that answer, to find that solution. That's why people are asking for it, because they don't have the time. So when you take the time, find it, and deliver it, they're like a dog, man. They'll follow you around all over the place. It's a beautiful thing.
And we know that the top 10 things to make you the coolest person in the world is to have a dog, right? And anyways, that was a joke. It didn't work out. It was a throwback to a couple minutes ago. But anyways, thanks, Dave, for joining us. Charles, take us out of here or help.
Be proud of who you are. Know that as much as you mess up on your podcast, and man, that wasn't perfect, and I forgot to say this, and something crashed or made this noise, it just know that you are the expert on your own show, and the people listening think you're awesome. And if you have to, just tell yourself, I am the expert of this. I dubbed myself the rock god of podcasting back in the early days of podcasting because I had no self-esteem. But once I started seeing the feedback, go, man, what you do is so awesome, and I'm going, it's horrible. That audio crapped out halfway through. How dare you say that was good? Understand that you see your mistakes, fix them, but know that you're the expert of what you're talking about, and that you're entertaining people if you're entertaining yourself. You can find my stuff. See, we do more of a life coaching kind of thing over at successfreaks.com. And if you're into playing Marvel Avengers Alliance or you want to get into it, I'm also at fromthehellocarrier.com.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. As a first-time roundtabler, sort of. We'll let it slide. We'll let the technicality slide. But awesome. Yeah, and as a recovering perfectionist, I take a lot of one saying that really helped me was to not let good enough get in the way of, or not let perfect get in the way of good enough, right? So was actually rambling through that an example of being perfect and good enough? Anyways, that would have bugged me. I would have edited it out a few years ago, but we'll just leave it, right? So don't, get it out there, right? Your podcasting, grow as you go, fix the mistakes. You don't have to have everything perfect. You don't have to have that microphone, and I'll just dive real quickly. I didn't even cover audio quality very much. There's some new standards. If you follow thepodcasterstudio.com, me over there, I'm going to talk a lot about audio post-processing and standards. I think it's important to not be fixated. We talked about microphones in the beginning, and we talked about how to use a microphone that would typically not be considered a best practice. The point is, get some information about what you're using, learn how to use it a little bit better, and then improve as you go. And then release, get it out there. You don't have a podcast until you start, so just start your podcast. So, Jon, you are a first-time roundtabler, so thank you so much for joining us. I believe you had signed up on the list. You were probably deep on the list, which I finally got to yank you out of there. And so if you are listening and you have signed up to the list and it's been a long time, I do these once every 2 weeks, and we only have a few people. So sorry it took so long, but thanks for joining us, Jon.
No problem. Thanks for having me on. And my, I guess my one piece of advice is do something that makes you happy, because it really does. That shines through. People, whether they're listening or watching you, they can tell when you're excited about something, they'll be excited about it as well. And I am over at smartpeoplepodcast.com. And again, Ray and panel, thank you guys so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great advice to go out on. I mean, we oftentimes start off being a little selfish. We start this for ourselves, and then we actually figure out, hey, people are listening, and they're giving us feedback, and then it becomes community, and we work on it together. But it kind of has to be for you in the beginning. At least it should be, because I think, as Charles alluded to in the beginning, you're going to have rough times when you get to episode 7. We know the famous stat. I mean, if you get to episode 20, 50, 100, it's hard to go on if you're not making yourself happy, if you're not talking about something you love to talk about. So great advice. Thanks, everybody. The chat room, they are awesome as well. I always wish we could pull more. Dave had an assignment. I think he came through. We got a good one over there. There was just so much more content, and that is the point. Go to podcastersroundtable.com specifically for this one /32. I am using it. I'm using a number. There's a debate there. Go to podcastersroundtable.com /32. I'm going to post everyone else's best practices. Submitted it. You'll be able to see that Google Doc. And that's it. Tune in next time when we do this live. You can be in the chat room, or you can subscribe wherever podcatcher you're using, iTunes, whatever. There's a million now. Pocket Cast, Android has all kinds. There is actual podcasting on Android. All right. That's another roundtable. Making jokes. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you next time. And wave, everybody.
That